Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Recently, Mr. John C. Wright posted a essay on his blog, which was, I think the title was the fine-tuning argument needs some fine-tuning. And then he published a follow-up called something like the argument from design is well designed. And in both of these, he is giving a criticism of the fine-tuning argument for the existence of God. And his criticism is, Mr. Wright, by the way, is a practicing Catholic, by the way. Used to be an atheist, used to be a very, very staunch atheist, and then actually his conversion story is quite fascinating. So I'll try to leave a link in the description to that too, if I can find it. But anyway, so these days he is a staunch Catholic, and as you may recall from my conversation with him, also very interesting man, very well studied and so on. Went to St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland, where they study the classics. Get an actually good education, a rare thing in the modern world. Anyhow, so Mr. Wright is a very interesting man worth listening to on this subject, and he makes a criticism of the fine-tuning argument. Which, for those who haven't heard, the fine-tuning argument is roughly speaking that if you look at all the things that had to be the case in order for life to appear on Earth, the size of the Earth, the distance of the Earth from the Sun, the size of the Sun, the various physical constants, some of them have to be, some of them had relatively small ranges they could, be in. Some of them have truly astonishingly tiny ranges they could be in. When it comes to the physical constants, like if gravity was a bit weaker, you would just have nothing but gas. If the gravitational constant was a bit higher, everything would just collapse and the universe wouldn't have been able to expand into interesting things. The relationship between the charge of an electron and gravity, that if it's too strong, if it's too weak, it's too weak, etc. Memory serves, if it's too strong, you can't get nuclear fusion until you get truly insanely giant things. And I think that's the one about the charge of an electron there. And there are tons and tons of these things all over the place where the relationships have to be, fairly precise. And there's one, my memory's escaping me, it might be related to the strong nuclear force. Something like that, where it has to be right to like one part in, variance by 1 part in like 10 to the 20th or something like that. Maybe more than that, 10 to the 27th. Something like that. Anyway, if it had varied by that much, then you would have, again, the universe would be completely uniform in some way or another. It wouldn't have the interesting characteristics that we actually have. Now, so Mr. Wright's, so because all these things are, it's so all fine-tuned, and if any of these things had been very far off, and some of them had been even very, very slightly off, you wouldn't get an interesting universe, and you certainly wouldn't get us. And so as a result, obviously, if everything has been this finely tuned to produce us, it must have been on purpose. That's, roughly speaking, the fine-tuning argument. And Mr. Wright makes the very sensible criticism of this argument that, well, you don't know what the probability of any of this stuff is. That you don't know how likely it is for were these things even independent of each other? You don't know. How were these things, selected? Were they really, were all possible values equally probable? No one has any idea. And where you have no idea of these things, you can't make a probability computation. It could be incredibly likely that such a thing would just happen, or it could be insanely unlikely, and you have no idea where in between these two things are because you lack the relevant data to establish the probabilities. And he is quite correct in this. In that sense, you can't make a decent probabilistic argument because all you're describing is your assumptions about what in Bayesian statistics would be called your priors. The basic, distributions of the various things. You're just assuming, because you have no way of knowing what the distributions of these things had been, if, if there even had been such a distribution at all, or what it would be, or so on. Like, nobody has a complete model of the universe, and given the incompleteness of your model of the universe, the generation of the universe, I mean the creation of the universe, the coming into existence of the universe. Given these things, or even just how if though it's nonsense, but if the universe had always existed, then how these parameters were chosen. Okay, that stuff. You have no one has a complete model of how these values were all came to be the values that they are. So no one can say whether or not they're likely or unlikely, because you can't say what model according to which they are likely or unlikely. Okay, so he is quite correct that basically as a probabilistic argument, it's a terrible argument, because all you're doing is describing your assumptions, more or less. But Mr. Wright, and I say this with great respect for how correct he is, and his general perspicacity about human nature, is missing, I think, why this argument actually is a fairly effective one for some people. For example, there's a video, this is in the end of my video, Christopher Hitchens Isn't Serious, where he was in a car with some other people, and he's talking about, and he said that, I think every prominent atheist gets asked, like, which of the opposing arguments do you think is the best? And he said, for me, it's the fine-tuning argument. That one really, almost gets me. And so why? Mr. Hitchens wasn't a sober man, but he was still an intelligent man. I don't know how well he understood statistics, but let's assume he had something of a native understanding, because everybody has a little bit of a native understanding of statistics, though. There are a number of surprises in statistics, if you don't study it formally, where people go wrong. Okay, well, using him as an example, but just generally, why does this have an effect? Why does this strike people? And it's because most atheists are materialists. Most Western atheists are materialists. Still, it's fairly true of Eastern atheists as well. At least, the Buddhism of Siddhartha Gautama was fairly, both atheistic and fairly materialistic. He had a slightly different belief as to what matter actually existed and so on, but it was basically materialistic, actually. So, within this, okay, so I bring up the materialism. The problem with materialism is you can't prove it. You cannot possibly prove, the world is too complex, you cannot possibly prove that only matter and its interactions, or, nowadays, forces, etc., whatever, naturalism. It's not like materialism, the generalization of materialism that includes, the forces and so on, there isn't a good way to define it anymore. Let's ignore that for a moment. Let's just concentrate on materialism, because that's basically what everyone does anyway. Just ignore the modern developments for the most part, when doing their philosophy. And so the thing about materialism is that you cannot possibly prove that, when something happened, the only things in there were the interactions of matter with each other. You don't actually know, like a dog walked across the street. You don't know everything that was going on inside of there. You've got absolutely no way of finding out. And moreover, an example I like to give, how could you prove that an electron that was being used actively in a thinking human brain actually had the same charge as an electron when you test on the bench doing, say, a milk and oil drop experiment? The moment you try to test with the thing, when you are measuring it, you are interacting with it. And as such, you are dislodging it from its actual functioning within the original system. It's the same way that, like, you could not possibly weigh a cylinder in a car. Like, take it out, a cylinder in a car, and put it on a scale while it is actually being fired inside of a gasoline engine, internal combustion engine. The very act of, measuring it is keeping it from doing its function. The same thing is true of an electron. If you're measuring the thing, if you're actually interacting with it in order to gauge its interactions with other stuff and compute its charge, you don't know what its charge... you are not letting it act as it normally would have within the system it came from, and therefore it is no longer part of that system, but part of your test apparatus. And so you are not, by definition, testing something that was actually in the original. Now, somebody especially experimentally minded would be able to say, like, well, you could look at the other things and then measure its interactions. But the problem is you're assuming that all those other things also have like the same masses and same forces and so on. You can't do this without assumptions built in. If you assume lots of things, then yes, you can make conclusions on the basis of those assumptions, but those are the assumptions that are being challenged, so you can't use assumptions that are being challenged to prove the assumptions that are being challenged. That problem generalizes. Materialism is generally not provable. You can say like, well, I don't know of anything else that contributed, but so what? Unless you're omniscient, that's irrelevant. Okay, you don't know about it. Big whoop. Materialism isn't provable. You can't possibly prove it. You can only take materialism on faith. For a human being. God could do it. But a human being can't. A human being can't possibly know all of these things, so he can't know what isn't, especially what isn't there. Because he can't see all of what is there. He can't see all of its interactions and so on. But materialism, though not provable, is still attractive to people because it's very simple. Materialism gives you a very, very, very simple idea of how the world works. It gives you an idea that's so simple you can fit it inside your head and feel like you understand the world. This is the strength, or attacking this, is the strength of the fine-tuning argument. Because, as Mr. Wright said, it is certainly the case that there could be some, the universe, which you only know part of, could be constructed in such a way that all of these things that seem very unlikely, like there would be complete freedom in the gravitational constant from 0 to infinity, in fact, aren't, and the values we have now are incredibly likely and other values incredibly unlikely. Yeah, that's true. But you have no reason to think it's true. And here's the problem. If you're even considering this, the simplicity of the materialist worldview has gone out the window and you can't even see it anymore. And that's why that fine-tuning argument actually has value in terms of persuasiveness. It's because to engage with the fine-tuning argument is to abandon the simplicity of materialism. Because the only way out of it is the one Mr. Wright showed, which is in fact a way out of it, but it's to acknowledge the complexity of the world and to acknowledge how much you don't know about the world. And the whole reason you're a materialist in the first place is because you want the faith of believing you actually know everything about the world, or, almost everything. There's always that little qualification thrown in, but, then immediately ignored. Someone will discover something new and that'd be interesting, but, it doesn't really matter. Not to your day-to-day life. That's the general approach. There's variation, of course, but that's the general approach I've seen. But the entirely correct way of getting out of this that Mr. Wright points out entirely contradicts the reason you would ever need to see this argument in the first place. So that's the very curious thing about this, and why the fine-tuning argument gets brought up. Is because if you take the fine-tuning argument seriously, you have to stop taking materialism seriously. At the very least, you have to recognize that materialism is a pure faith that you have, and not something that you have, not something that you can demonstrate to anybody. It is, moreover, not something that you even have much of a good reason to believe in. That's a kind of rabbit hole. Why is anybody a materialist? And that's a long historical sort of thing. So I don't want to get into that. So let's ignore that. It's just you can't prove materialism. You can believe that it is true on the basis of other things, and reason to it that the thing that seems most likely to me to be true on the basis of the facts that I do know about the world is materialism, and then you can have faith in that it's true on the basis of, this is based on all the evidence you've seen, this is your best guess for the world, just as you can, based on all the evidence that you've seen, Christianity is your best guess for the world, or Buddhism is your best guess for the world, or Hinduism is your best guess for the world, or, what have you. Like, these things are true. I can't prove them right in the moment, but the world I'm in points to these things being true, and so I have faith that it is true. You can do that, but you have to at least admit that that's what you're doing with materialism. And materialism is a bizarre, bizarre faith to have the moment you actually admit that it's just a faith, that it's a faith. When I say just a faith, I don't mean that in the same sense that the atheists do. But when you admit that materialism is not necessitated by things, that this is you working out what you have to the best of your ability, but, that's it. That it's, it's the conclusion, it is a rational conclusion on the basis of, well, for some materialists anyway, it's a rational conclusion. For others, I think it's it's still a rational conclusion, but, we do tend to draw a distinction between a rational conclusion you came to on your own and a rational conclusion which somebody you trust has given you, and you just trust them, and by extension, the other thing. That's most of life, by the way. Most of life is lived by trusting other people, so there's no shame in that. That's how most of us know most things. That's kind of the distinction is drawn. So, to bring all this together into sort of the final point, the fine-tuning argument is useful, and I think can be worth discussing. I mean, I don't bring it up myself, but some people do, precisely because it is a fairly potent, though by no means surefire, antidote to the desire for simplicity that drives a lot of modern materialism. Because the fine-tuning argument proves that whatever the world is, it's not simple and fits in your head. Because, of course, the simple fits in your head is just, all these constants are just random. That's, we're not chosen according to any scheme, and just, could be anything. That's nice and simple. Anything else other than that would produce the uniform thing, where in the current world is insanely unlikely, is way, way bigger and doesn't fit in your head, and you also don't know it. So that, I think, is my partial disagreement with Mr. Wright on this subject. That what he said was correct, but in the bigger picture, the argument can be used as an antidote to certain types of bad thinking. And so once a person's freed from that type of bad thinking and realizes that whatever the universe is something that's not going to fit inside of his head, he's in a much better position to start evaluating all the possibilities than when he thought there was an opportunity to have something that did fit in his head where he understood everything. So, hope that's interesting or helpful, and until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.